This is Ibarian X, and this is The Candid Frame. Last year, I was honored to be asked to serve as a judge to determine who would be awarded a generous grant from the Aftermath Project, a nonprofit organization which for over a decade has supported the work of photographers telling the stories of what happens when war and conflict end. All day long, my fellow judges and I looked at photographs and read the proposals of stories of how people and communities struggle to return to a state of normalcy after years of violence, betrayal, and desperation. What happens to the people left behind when the journalists and diplomats have left to pursue another story or other troubles? It's that question that has been at the heart of the work of today's guest, Sara Terry, a photographer and filmmaker. For her, it is the story of what comes after that she feels is deserving of our attention, especially after the more obvious stories have been told and pictures have been made. She believes that these narratives deserve more than a clinical exposition of facts. Even when a forensic anthropologist she was working with asked her to make an image in a mass grave, she realized that there was a moment of hope in the midst of unimaginable tragedy.
And she's going, Sara, here, look here. And so I put her little point and shoot up to my eye, and I nearly threw up because she was holding the preserved hand, preserved not like we would think of hands today, but unusually well preserved hands of what had been a teenage boy from Srebrenica, attached to his body. And it was a really important forensic anthropological thing, and she wanted me to document it. And so as I took the picture for her and was just like, oh my God, let me get out of here fast, I was like, oh no, Sara, that's the picture you've been waiting to make. And I picked up the Leica and I made a photograph of Eva and Piotr in that grave with those surrounded by these horrible things. And Eva is holding the hand of this boy. And it's like the final image in the Love and Death chapter. It's one of the most definitive images in my career, because I realize that that's the place I want to stand after war. I want to be there when humanity shows up and says, no, you don't get the last word. The evil that made this happen, the horror that was in this moment, you don't get the last word, because we show up, because we're human, because we aren't going to say, that's the end. We're here.
For her photographic work, she's been honored with a Guggenheim Fellowship as well as a membership in the photo agency 7. But despite her many accomplishments as a photographer, her professional career actually began as a writer and journalist. And it likely would have remained that way had it not been for a personal tragedy that changed her life forever. Instead of words, she turned to photography to rediscover herself and find a new visual language by which to express herself.
In that first summer, as I began shooting, there's things that are still in my work today. And I worked a lot around the edges of the frames. I did a lot of reflections and a lot of kind of windows. And I didn't, and fragments, a lot of pieces of things. And in that particular summer, I had a lot of pieces of body parts that would show up, like a hand on the edge of a frame, a broken statue foot. I mean, I remember those images, and I showed them. There weren't a lot of people who knew what was going on in my life at that time, but one of my really close friends did, and she had an art history background. And when I came home from Italy that summer, I was showing her a few things, and I said, isn't this crazy? Look at all these, I don't know why I'm shooting everything in fragments. And she just looked at me and she said, Sara, your life has been shattered into a million pieces. You're trying to make sense of it. It's not a surprise at all.
I'll talk to Sara about her many projects, including her documentation of forgiveness practices in several countries in Africa, including Sierra Leone, Rwanda, and South Africa, and also how the Aftermath Project came into being. Welcome to The Candid Frame. Welcome to the show. It's really a pleasure to have a chance to see you and talk with you again.
Thank you, Barnix. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, because we were so busy judging for the Aftermath project, we really didn't have a real decent time to sit down and chat. Our dinner afterwards was very nice.
Dinner was good, yeah, but we sure did a lot of judging.
Oh my God,
and
was
talking.
A lot of work, which we're going to talk about here.
Okay.
What was really interesting about you in doing my research for you is that you didn't start as a photographer, and you changed up at some point. You were a journalist for the Christian Science Monitor. You did stuff, probably NPR. Was it before or after?
I helped start the Monitor's public radio program, so that's where my first public radio was. And then I went freelance into magazines, Rolling Stone, Boston Globe Magazine, New York Times Magazine. And then here in LA, I came back around to guest hosting at KCRW for Warren Holney.
Okay. And so what was the catalyst for you picking up the camera?
It's a long story, but the short version is that...
Give us a long version.
Yeah, I don't think you want it. We'll go short version, and you can see... It's a deeply personal space in my life. There's a personal crisis in my life when words failed me for the first time in my life. And I mean, they failed me. And for somebody the joke in my family was that I grew up talking. You know, my 6th grade teacher thought I was going to be a criminal defense attorney, and the vice principal thought I would be a union labor leader. I mean, that's how I used words. It's how I trusted them. And they didn't work when I needed them to. So it was just such a shock to me that I literally stopped writing. I stopped taking assignments. And I stopped talking to most of the people I knew. Kind of by accident, I picked up a camera as a way of trying to communicate with somebody that couldn't be reached by words at that time. The images were to remind him of who he was and what his memories were. Mm-hmm. And along the way, I found out that instead of me telling him where he had been, the images started to tell me where I was going. And I fell in love with it. It became the language I'd always looked for. When I was married, my ex is a musician, and he literally breathes through music by playing guitar. And he would say to me, "But that's what writing is like for you, isn't it?" And I was like, "No, if you told me tomorrow I could never write another page on a news story again, I'd be fine with that." And then when I found photography, it was like, oh, that's the language. I understand now. That's how I breathe. You can't. I'd die if you took it away from me.
How long was that period where you had stopped writing and before you picked up the camera? Was that a pretty long time?
It was almost concurrent that I stopped writing and picked up the camera because I was trying to be in conversation. But the period of transition for me lasted about, 2 years, 3 years, where I was picking up the camera. And it was another 2 or 3 years before I let words come back into my work. I used to with photography at first, I was so... If people started talking about their work or talking about photography, I would leave the room. I only could absorb it by looking at it and watching it. So, yeah, it was a process of re-knitting and re-healing and just reprioritizing the different languages, that I have, verbal, visual, And
you started with a flip phone, right?
I did. I started. What did I have at the time? I had a Pentax. I moved into a Leica pretty quickly. I was working with Ektachrome. But within that period of time, within a couple of years after I think I started shooting, the Sony Ericsson P910 came out, and that was the first camera phone. And I was one of the first people shooting with it. Robert Clark and I were the only people I know who actually did projects with it, with those little tiny retro 166 kilobyte files that are magic. I had a show of it a year or so ago, and people were like, "What filter did you use?" And I'm like, "Not a filter. Not a filter. That would be the limitations of the camera." So yeah, I love it. I found the phone in my studio the other day.
Oh, did you?
I still have it. Yeah.
Yeah, it's quite amazing to think that these cameras that may not be as impressive as DSLRs, but the freedom that it provides you. Did the fact that it was so simple and that it wasn't burdened by all the choices, something that allowed you to find what you felt you were lacking from writing? So
picking up the camera, and finding out that the images were telling me about how I was doing, how I was healing, and that I was getting better. And it was showing, when I learned when I could see really clearly that a photograph is as much about the person who's making the photograph as it is about what's being shot, which I think is really, really true, in street. Yeah. When you're not going out with any kind of an agenda, like photojournalism. I think the way it helped me heal was so profound. That's why I moved away from words and into cameras. And And with the Sony Ericsson P910, this time in my life just continued to be really tumultuous. After getting over this one difficult spot, it kind of was out of the frying pan and into the fire. But I was photographing by then, and I was literally, if you think I travel a lot now, I was crisscrossing the world. I mean, over a period of 2 years, I was like Ingushetia, Azerbaijan, Sierra Leone, Liberia, Afghanistan, all over the U.S., all these places, and Istanbul. And it was using that cell phone camera at that time, was a way of I did a little book out of it. It was like a visual diary, and my life was so chaotic. It was like that little camera was unencumbered. It was just me. And it's really more like a cell phone even than an iPhone, like a little tiny screen. But it was a way that I could make still lives in this really chaotic life of mine. The first one I took, and I remember it blew me away, was in a woman's hammam in Istanbul, a steam bath, where you're not supposed to have cameras. But I just was it was so magic. It was one of the very old hammams, and with the steam coming up. And I just picked the phone up and I took a picture. And I remember I sent it to a gallerist who just was like, "Oh my God, like who knew, that cell phones could be used to make art." And that's still one of my favorite pictures that I've ever made today. But so then I began knowing that I was echoing Turkish miniatures, those very small paintings. So I was working within that continuum. And it was just a way that with that particular piece, and it's somewhat the way I use my iPhone now, it was just a way of setting everything down and just being where I was and looking, for still lives.
It's really interesting that you discovered that sort of early on in the process of making pictures, because I think that's something that usually comes later, because people are looking at their photographs as these documentary objects, and that you're seeing so early on that you were seeing that it was so self-reflective.
That has to do with how I healed. I mean, that has to do with literally, so like that first time I went to Tuscany, I was taking a fiction writing workshop, and I stayed to take a photography workshop with somebody I'd heard of, but I didn't know much about, and it was Joel Meyerowitz.
Oh, okay.
During that time, it was funny. Joel was like, "You need to be dancing with people. You need to be in the street more." And I was like, "No, actually, I don't. That's not where I am right now." And in that first summer, as I began shooting, there's things that are still in my work today. And I worked a lot around the edges of the frames. I did a lot of reflections and a lot of kind of windows. And I didn't, and fragments, a lot of pieces of things. And in that particular summer, I had a lot of pieces of body parts that would show up, like a hand on the edge of a frame, a broken statue foot. I mean, I remember those images, and I showed them. There weren't a lot of people who knew what was going on in my life at that time, but one of my really close friends did, and she had an art history background. And when I came home from Italy that summer, I was showing her a few things, and I said, "Isn't this crazy? Like, look at all these, like, I don't know why I'm shooting everything in fragments." And she just looked at me and she said, "Sarah, your life has been shattered into a million pieces. You're trying to make sense of it. It's not a surprise at all." And that's like what did it for me. I was like, oh my gosh, who knew that that's what photography could be, and that's what photography could do? So my beginnings in photography were all about intuition and understanding its relationship to me. I mean, I had been a journalist for 20 years. I'd worked in, newspapers, magazines, public radio, and won, tons of awards. And this is a completely different part of who I am that I access when I make a photograph. And it's also why I didn't really go into photojournalism once I picked up that camera, because I didn't want to repeat what I'd already done as a writer. So it's why I protected that space. It's why I've done long-term projects. It's why I've done other work, consulting or teaching or whatever to protect the photography. So, I mean, I'm happy to do reportage or an assignment when it comes up, but, that's kind of a long answer to your saying. I mean, it's where I began in that space. And then largely, I'd already had part of a career, so I was older. It wasn't like I really am so not the technical person in photography. Anything I teach, I'm like, okay, this is not going to be the class where we talk about f-stops and shutter speeds. Although I can do that a little bit. But it's what I'm always working is to connect people, the students I have, to their sort of intuitive voice.
It seems like it was like the right time for you.
Yeah.
In terms of your career, in terms of what you had accomplished already, but also in terms of this new self that you were discovering in parallel with that.
They were hand in hand.
Yeah, and that they just sort of converged in that sort of one critical moment, and that you found something that gave you a different voice or a different lens through which you could see your life and everything that are around you?
It gave me a language that I feel most adept at. And being a highly verbal person, it says a lot that I feel most adept at a nonverbal language.
Let's talk about your first project, which was in Bosnia, where you photographed the aftermath of the war. And I want to continue on this line that we're doing right now, because you had all this experience as a writer where you would get all this information and then you would have to sort of repurpose it to tell a story on the page.
Yep.
But you go there to Bosnia after the conflict, and you're having to, in photographs, capture and express something that is not easily grasped. In conflict, you can take a picture of someone shooting a rifle. It's very obvious.
Images are everywhere, yeah.
But the ramifications of any long conflict sometimes can be very subtle. So tell me about that process of you wanting to tell a tale visually, yet having all this experience as a writer, telling that story in words rather than photographs.
It's an interesting, I think the project, which was, it's called Aftermath, Bosnia's Long Road to Peace. And in a lot of ways, that's a transition project for me, because the part of me that had so much training in journalism and so many years of experience came into that project, which sort of going, okay, now you need to think about the exhumations of the mass graves, and you need to think about returning refugees. I kind of I plotted out these 5 areas, which, I'm a huge respecter of photographers do so much research, and I respect that on long-term projects. I mean, I'm part of that tradition as well. But for 2 years, I felt myself so, and I didn't know it at first, but what was happening was I was really weighed down by the sense of journalistic responsibility to get the story right. And I literally remember at the 2-year point, I was like, but that's not why I'm a photographer. That was why I was a reporter. That's why I was a writer. So what am I missing here? And there were 2 questions that I worked with, and also poetry that helped me go back into that very intuitive space where I would I would place myself in situations that mattered, like the mass graves of the Srebrenica victims, where there was an annual ceremony, or I'd be where refugees were returning, or of course I'd go to the places, but I just freed myself up to respond to the things that trigger me as a photographer. So the first 2 years were a little more journalistic, and then the second 2 years is where it really unlocked, to the kind of work I do. And then they worked together by the end. Kind of in the 5th years, I began editing them together, and I pretty much edited to poetry and to words again. But it was, I don't know how to say that, like, you just have to, you know what it is? It's like when I started shooting, I remember somebody going, oh, how fantastic. Now you can take pictures to go with the articles that you write. And I remember I just looked at them and I was like, no. That would make me literally crazy. That's like trying to go into and out of a revolving door at the same time. They are 2 entirely different ways of thinking. It's why I get so annoyed with what the industry has become and pressuring photographers to also do video, also do writing. It's like, no, you know what? Then pay for all those 3 different things, because those are 3 different headspaces.
Was there a particular photograph that you could point to that when you look at it, you felt like this was an indicator of that transition during that time?
Yeah. I know one image that I know was like, I was like, there you go. There's a place in Sarajevo where the architecture of the Ottoman Empire in the old town meets the sort of newer part of town, which was sort of the Austro-Hungarian architecture of the Habsburg Empire, and it's a really physical space. If you just happen to look up, you can kind of go, whoa, those are different buildings. And I was shooting into, again, window reflections, staying with me because that's something I'd worked at from the beginning, and very conscious of what's going on in the reflection and all those layers, and then getting serendipity. But it was right at that borderline between the 2, and I was photographing a very modern, like, beauty store, and in the reflection with pictures of women in kind of European hairdos and things. It was like very Western. But then in a corner of the picture, there's more peasant type women dressed in scarves. indicating a Muslim background, just in a more, just their dress was more peasant. So I was kind of part of the project, it's about those two worlds meeting and the contradictions and pulls from it. That's one. I think it's the second or third image in the first chapter of the book. It stayed in there. And also my influences at the time weren't really photography. I didn't know much about other photographers. So my influences were painting, fine art, so I can look at that work and I go, oh, right, there's a, Vermeer, that's a Magritte. Yeah. There's a very much an M.C. Escher type work in there.
There's an image which I think is part of that period of a fish tank with fish on either the hood or the boot of the car.
That's the cover photo. You're right. That's a great example.
So that image for me is really interesting because it is a less than obvious photograph. In terms of the subject matter that you're...
What would you say the subject matter is if you look at that? It is a stumper.
Yeah, but I think that, one, the ability to recognize it is one thing. I mean, it's sort of odd that you have this fish tank on there, but within the context of the story you're telling, I think it's something that a lot of people would miss. And I think that when I think of any sort of documentary or photojournalistic work that involves issues of conflict, so much of it revolves around people. And this image is really sort of a fascinating one because as you start exploring it a little more, you start going, wait a second. So for you, did you have an understanding of why you were making the photograph, or were you just drawn by the visual elements in the scene to make the photograph, and then the context came later?
So the goldfish bowl is like a perfect example. Like I'm glad you picked it out. Remember I said I had a couple of questions that I set myself up to that was the assignment I gave myself. No longer the literal stuff, like I no longer worried if I was capturing things exactly, like, oh, that represents this. So the question I had on that trip was, what am I not seeing? And if you ask yourself that as a photographer, and that's one of the key questions in a course I teach about finding your visual voice. But it's like, it's not, did I get X, Y, Z? Did I do, this, that, and the other? And this was maybe 3 years into my work. And it was like, what am I not seeing? And that particular day, it had been a really tough, long day of shooting. I think I'd been at the sort of Catholic religious site, Medjugorje, where there had supposedly been a sighting of the Virgin Mary in the 60s, I think it was. And that particular day, just wanted to get down to the coast of Croatia, where there's a hotel I liked, where I was going to have just a break. So I'm kind of flying down the road, and I look to my right, and there's a guy with his car parked by the side of the road, and there's goldfish tanks on his car. And it's like, nothing else around. And I looked at it, and I was like, well, that's odd. And the voice in my head, because I'm really tuned into this question I've given myself for that whole trip. What am I not seeing? And it was like, stop the car. I was like, yeah, no, I want to get down to the coast before it gets dark. And I made it, I don't know, a few hundred yards more down the road, and the voice came up, stop the car. And I was like, no, like, my mom's a goldfish bowls. What do I care? And I got, I don't know, maybe half a mile down the road, and it was like, stop the freaking car. And I was like, got it. And I turned around, and I came back and photographed the goldfish bowls. It was an extraordinary, absurdist moment and space, and it became the cover of the book because I understood that if I put the first image in the book, which is such a beautiful image of a widow looking into body bags, it's not a graphic one, but it's that's what it is. And I thought, if I put that photo on the cover, people are going to look at it and go, oh, I know what that is. I don't want to read that book or look at that book. And I thought, but if I put the picture of the goldfish bowls on the cover, people won't be able to say they know what the book is about. And then years later, Ann Tucker, who you probably know, she's now the curator emeritus at the Museum of Fine Arts, Houston, like one of the smartest people in the world on photography. She had bought 3 pictures from the project for the museum's collection. And she was looking at the goldfish bowl picture, and she said, Sarah, do you think this picture is about a desire for healing or something like that? And I'm like, I don't know, Anne, I kind of think of it as like the world was looking at Bosnia like it was a goldfish bowl during the war. And I'm kind of blathering on, and I'm like, oh my God, I'm talking to Ann Tucker. Shut up. And I was like, I just stopped and said, Anne, what do you think? And she said, that picture is all about the desire for a return to beauty and light. She said, it's a perfect, summation of your work. And I was like, wow. So you have to like disassociate your mental impressions. You have to like stop the side of the door, the revolving door that wants to get out. And you have to like, I tell people I like tie the part of myself up that's the thinking part of me. I will tie it up and put it in a closet when I need to go out and shoot and get to the heart of something.
Yeah, it's a sign of any good story or any good photograph when different people can read it, and then they put themselves in it, and each of them comes out with a very different interpretation.
That photo, I've had 13-year-olds in classrooms in South Africa where I was teaching visual literacy. I've had the ways that people go after that photo and the things that they know and say about it, and of course our own experiences feed that, right? Our own reactions, our own perceptions, our own lives, are what help us read an image like that. That image is not telling you what to think.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, it's the one great thing in the photo that I love, because there's a lot of photos in the book that echo this. There's a road that goes down the right-hand side of the picture. And the title of the project is, Bosnia, Aftermath, Bosnia's Long Road to Peace. So that just kind of subtly supports it. I mean, I think when you're really dialed in to the emotional space, the intuitive space, to whatever trigger you need, poetry, I use the poetry of Wisława Szymborska a lot, or poetry in whatever place I'm working. But if you're dialed in there, then I think you're working, like firing in a really amazing way to the connections that live beneath the surface, that become universal. They don't become so didactic, and that's actually the type of photography I'm, most drawn to. But I think it's because that's what photography did for me, right? It went beneath the surface of my life and showed me what I was going through.
Yeah. You've said that you like photographs that ask questions rather than being sort of definitive. And I think that is probably one of the most difficult things to succeed at doing in a photograph, because we're so accustomed to being absolute about what we're seeing. So when you expect that from a photograph, how do you translate that into a way of seeing and being in a moment that is understandable to people who are aspiring to create images that are that kind of nuanced and complex and not just so.
How do you make it? You mean like what do you?
Yeah, it's an interesting proposition, the idea of images that ask questions, because when I'm making a photograph, I'm typically aware of every element in the frame and the relationship between all of those things, and I'm very much sort of in control over what the image looks like. And to some degree, I am in control of what I'm trying to express in that photograph, right? And then the idea of making it open-ended in a way, I think, has to be about being able to allow or invite some elements into the frame that I'm not in complete control over. I'm trying to sort of reach this sort of idea of how, because the idea of creating images that raise questions is a really interesting one, but how sort of translate that into the actual mechanics of seeing and photographing is one that sort of eluded me.
It's kind of like, again, this is exactly what I work with photographers in that class I teach about visual voice. But you have to approach the work not knowing, right? You have to. So I think the tools that you have, you practice your tools, you practice complex compositions. All that stuff finally, becomes interior to your process. It took me maybe a year, I think, of consciously practicing complex compositions, working with foreground, middle ground, background, putting myself in places where I could make it happen. I was very consciously thinking about it. And about a year or so, I think it just integrated into the way I think and see. And so it's there. I know it's there. I know the things that trigger me. I know how I respond to light. I know what gesture does for me. Those are just things I know about myself. And so in making a photograph, it's kind of like you have to put all that aside. You have to enter this space of not knowing. It's like you have to let the photo show you where it is. And everything that you know how to do is going to be there for you, right? All those tools also become part of your subconscious, and they won't fail you. I have a really great exercise somebody gave me very early on. It was Stephen Ferry, I think, about how to compose better in color. It was you walk down the street and you pick a color that's on the street, and you have to be moving to do this. And let's say you notice a forest green sign. And then as you keep walking down the street, you have to look for that green everywhere you go. And it's got to be the exact green, not just any shade of green, but that shade of green. So you're looking for it. as you go. So what you're doing in that training exercise is you're training your eye to be assessing where color is and how it composes in a photo. And then that ultimately, once it internalizes, it starts emerging just naturally. You start composing in color. So those tools are always there. And, and sometimes I'm conscious of something. Sometimes I'm kind of like, oh, wait, I need to move a little bit, to this direction or whatever. That's natural. But, it's also like, I find students want to tell me what a photo is about.
Yeah.
They talk about it. They go, I felt this way and I was doing that and that. And I literally am notorious in my teaching for going to say nothing. Say nothing, because I can't hear your photo if you're talking to me about it. It's a competing voice in my head. Stop. There's a conversation this photo wants to have with me, with all of us. And it wants to have it with you too, you person who made the photo, So you can't always work that way. If you're on an assignment, if you're doing reportage, of course you're having to think through what the editor needs, what's the shot that's the opening shot, what's your, interior stuff. But even in that context, you can still kind of kick into this space. And I think one way to do it is just to like go shoot on a weekend or put yourself in a place that makes you feel very secure.
Okay.
Or another way, I would probably start there. You can also go into another space that's like completely jarring and you don't know what's going on. That's maybe a next step down the road. And then just like shoot. It's just like, I don't even like the word shoot pictures so much. I like make pictures. But the reason I love teaching this visual voice class is it's because it's a process of several exercises in a row. I can break people down, from the thinking process, and they can see what their photos are saying. Your photos are telling you a lot.
Yeah, I think it's really kind of interesting because it takes you from making pictures in a way that you think they should look like to images that
are yours.
Yeah.
That are nobody else. See, so the images of what it should look like, those are the pictures that, generally speaking, 100 people standing in the same place would make exactly that picture.
Exactly.
Oh, look, it's sunset. Oh, look, it's this, object. And and there's the perfect, composition of thirds. And it's like, those are learned behaviors. And they will create repetitive stereotypical images because anybody can do them. Your mind can cope with that. But the image that nobody else can make is the one that comes from your intuitive response.
Yeah, and it's also reflected in people who are really into photography, in which they emulate different photographers, like Alex Webb, his layered composition. And so you see that same thing where people never get to the point where they're really expressing something honest and true of themselves. It's just merely a reflection of the photographs that they're consuming.
And those are just tools, and they're important. I don't diss them. I mean, I think it's important I'll say it to my students sometimes too. It's like, there's a reason to know the rules, or there's a reason to learn what makes a complex composition hang together, but there's a space where you have to work completely with no thought for those rules, because following rules is what makes us all the same. Yeah. There are things you need to have in common as a language, I'm okay with that. But if you want to make an image that somebody looks at and it's like, whoa, that's so-and-so, or wow, nobody else could have made that photograph. It's because nobody else could. I mean, when I send students out on these assignments that are the most simple assignments, and they see how everybody has a completely different visual answer to the question, it starts to blow their minds, right? And I'm always fascinated with the work. It's because people are in this really vulnerable space that's just about, I'm showing you who I am, and those photos then come back into part of your arsenal, if you're doing reportage or long-term work or whatever. But that, one of the best gifts you can give yourself as a photographer is to find the spaces to work like that, where you don't have a voice in your head, or you don't have an agenda, you don't have an assignment,
There are thousands of people from all over the world who listen to this show every week. And though I hear from you every once in a while in emails or when I go to events, I've been wanting to find a way for all of you to get to know each other. So what I want to offer you is a little something. I want you to be the person that introduces the show. Each week, I'd like to have a different listener to share who you are, where you're from, and introduce the show. It would sound something like, I'm Paul Anthony Gonzalez from Miami, Florida, and welcome to The Candid Frame. That's it. Nice and simple and clean. Your name, where you're from, and the introduction to the show. You'd then provide me a link to your website or Instagram feed, and I would include that in the show notes for that week. How does that sound? You could record it in any variety of ways using your computer or your smartphone, but just try to make it as good quality audio as you can. Use a microphone if you have it, but more importantly, find a nice, quiet place to record it, and then send the file to me via email at info@thecandidframe.com. That's it. You don't even have to be a Patreon supporter to do this, but if you aren't, why not make the time to support the show today by committing $5 or more a month to our Patreon campaign, which helps to sustain and improve the show. Visit patreon.com/The Candid Frame. Thanks. Well, let's take the spine of this conversation that we're having about photography.
In which I'm like talking a lot.
No, this is a podcast. This is I love this stuff. So let's take the spine of what we're doing and sort of just shift it in terms of the story that you were telling in Bosnia and that you've told subsequently. Mm-hmm. In terms of there is traditional narrative, for lack of a better word, in terms of what happens after war. After the soldiers have left and all the diplomats have signed their papers and done the handshakes, and you go in with those same ideas and concepts in your head, because that's in growing up, you hear that same narrative over and over and over again. So you go out to Bosnia to tell a story of what the aftermath of conflict really is. How did you get to the point where you could move past those assumptions, those cliches that you yourself had, and allow the story to sort of reveal itself and not be adversely influenced by your assumptions or your perceptions going in? Well,
the good thing going into that was like, there's not really a lot of narrative around post-conflict storytelling, right? There aren't, unless maybe you go research the Marshall Plan, or something like that after World War II. There weren't any narratives for me to follow. The narrative, the most dominant narrative in news and photojournalism at the time was war. It was Afghanistan and Iraq, and those were all the awards and all the assignments and all the headlines. And I get that. I grew up in journalism. I know what headlines are for. So there wasn't anything hanging over me, in a way of like that I had to emulate. But I did have that part of me as a journalist, like I mentioned the topic areas. As I thought about it, well, like how would I tell this is what it takes to, put a country back together again, or this is what post-conflict looks like. The media's gone on, but here's the stories. It's refugees returning. It's bodies being dug up or whatever. So on one level, because this is my first project transitioning from a journalist, I get to hang on to those. It's like, yeah, it's that. It's the breaking into the poetry of a story that I find so meaningful. It's the disassociation with a linear narrative, and it's the willingness to go into abstract spaces. It's the willingness to take something that's a marker of something or something that, says something. I mean, I can tell you one place that I broke through on that. It was there's a very slim chapter in the book called Love and Death. It's about the exhumations, and I spent tons of time with these two Polish forensic anthropologists who'd worked in the graves for years, because there were so many mass graves of largely Bosnian Muslims, and they helped me learn. So I'd spend time with them. I'd be in rooms with them. I'd be at excavations where there were just these hideous, smelly, horrible pits. I'd be in rooms where skeletons had been cleaned and laid out with the clothes that had been found with them so that people could hopefully identify their family members, and then DNA processing would follow. I was with them as they were cleaning bones. I mean, I spent like every type of situation you could have with them. And I remember them telling me that they thought what they were telling was a story about life, because by giving the name back to the person who'd been in a mass grave, they were giving them back their life, and the families, they were giving them back their loved ones. And so that kind of starts to crack you open a little bit, right? From like, it's just about DNA and bones and the numbers and statistics and what happened during the war. But for the first 2 or 3 years easily, and like I said, I was in a lot of mass graves, I didn't take very good pictures of it. I remember looking at the pictures at one point and going, you're not close enough. And it's like, I don't want to be any closer to this than I am. I did not, it was especially the graves. I felt like I'd gotten some things in some of the witnessing spaces of people looking at them, but not the graves. And all my pictures from before that, I'm on the rim of something. You can see like, the big diggers pulling things out. I was like, oh, geez, I need to be closer. Oh, and I kind of let it sit. And I didn't think about it for a while. And I think it was on the next trip, I was in one of the mass graves of Srebrenica victims. And this woman, Eva, the lead forensic anthropologist, she called to me and she said, she had a little like point and shoot camera. And she said, I want you to take a picture. And she called me into the pit. And I don't think I had ever gone into the exhumation pit before. And I was like, oh, Eva, I don't want to do that. And she's like, no, come on. It's really important. So I pick up her little camera and my Leica's, strung around my shoulders. And I kind of go over to her and I have to stand on a mound as they excavate mounds. So it's literally got bones and mud and stuff in it. And I'm like just kind of putting my foot where I see mud, no bones. And she's, she and her assistant are really kind of going after this group of bodies and clothes. And I'm like, oh. And she's going, Sara, here, look here. And so I put her little point and shoot up to my eye, and I nearly threw up because she was holding the preserved hand. Preserved not like we would think of hands today, but unusually well preserved hands of what had been a teenage boy from Srebrenica attached to his body. And it was a really important forensic anthropological thing, and she wanted me to document it. And so as I took the picture for her and was just like, oh my God, let me get out of here fast, I was like, oh no, Sara, that's the picture you've been waiting to make. And I picked up the Leica, and I made a photograph of Eva and Piotr in that grave with those surrounded by these horrible things. And Eva is holding the hand of this boy. And it's like the final image in the Love and Death chapter. It's one of the most definitive images in my career, because I realized that's the place I want to stand after war. I want to be there when humanity shows up and says, no, you don't get the last word. The evil that made this happen, the horror that was in this moment, you don't get the last word, because we show up, because we're human, because we aren't going to say, that's the end. We're here. And the really odd thing, so remember I told you earlier, I have lots of fine art influences.
Right.
It took me 6 months of looking at that picture before I understood that what I had made was an echo of the Sistine Chapel, when Jehovah touches the hand of Adam and gives him life. And I was like, whoa. So I don't think I could. So all of my history and things I know and things that move me, my art references, they're all there. I'm not having to sit there and access them. I'm also dealing completely with total revulsion of the space that I'm in, but quieting all of that and saying, no, there's an image that wants to be seen here. I didn't do any great magic, I don't think, but I needed to see it. And it did not let me go. So I think that's an image to me that's very much to the heart of what you're talking about, where I had to give myself to the space, to the emotions, and the best of me, the things that move me as a visual person, were all there to support me. We're all there to go, Sara, Sistine Chapel, not even conscious of it, but every other part of me is going, that's your frame.
Yeah, and there's certain photographs that just demand to be made.
Yeah.
And in my experience, there's sometimes been resistance to making the photograph for whatever reason. What have you found?
How's it show? How's it reveal?
Sometimes there's just I see something about to play out with somebody on the street, and I know that in order to get the shot that I know needs to be made, I have to move in. I have to get close. I have to risk invading someone's space or being recognized in order for that image to happen. But I feel it right here in my gut. It's just like, it's there. are you going to do it? And sometimes I've done it, and sometimes I haven't. But even though I don't relate to the circumstances that you just described, the physical experience is exactly
Of course it
the
is.
same.
And it's just like so your visual voice is speaking. It's hearing the photo. That's what's going on. And that's when intellect and common sense and everything else get in the way. And those are the things that I think we have to learn to roll back, to put in the closet, to tie up and say, not here and not now, because I need to be present, with this visual language. Yeah, it's I think it's just sort of like a heart charge, right? Mm-hmm. And if you're thinking from your head, you're not going to be hearing your heart.
Oh, no. Yeah, you don't recognize those moments if you're not in that space.
Right.
If you're in your head all the time, moments like that pass
right.
you up all the time. There was another part of your work in terms of documenting the aftermath of conflict was in Sierra Leone. And that, I think, was really sort of interesting. And what I kind of want to explore is, in those, you were making photographs of these girls who had been attacked and violated.
There's a two-part thing in Sierra Leone. One was a collaboration with an ex-girl soldier. Okay. We did it together. And the other was the documentation of the recreation of this cultural tradition of resolving conflict through conversation. That's Fambul Tok.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, which I made a documentary film ultimately.
Yeah, I want to talk about both. But the first one is the one that you did with the girl. And I thought that was really sort of fascinating to me, because you made your photographs of her, but she also had the opportunity to take the camera and create images that reflected her experience. And I thought, wow, that is really sort of fascinating in terms of each of you creating images of someone's life experience. One person who is very savvy in terms of image making and composition, and someone who is strictly just coming from the gut.
She was astonishing.
And so what did you expand on what that collaboration was about and what you learned from it as a photographer and a storyteller?
I found her. I used the pseudonym Miriam. I couldn't use her real name at the time, so I still don't. But she was to be testifying at the special court against Charles Taylor, who was the president of Liberia, but he was indicted for his role in the war in Sierra Leone and Blood Diamonds. So I couldn't use her name. I learned about her through somebody at the special court who had done some work with her. I knew that she was really creative. She'd staged a play. People were like, "Oh, this is a great person for you to meet." And she was living in a place outside of Freetown, the capital, that wasn't where she was from. She'd tried to go back to her village but couldn't. She was an ex-child soldier. She had been the bush wife of a very high-up commander who was Liberian. The project was about, it's part of my Guggenheim work. It's called Forgiveness and Conflict, Lessons from Africa. And I was exploring forgiveness traditions in post-conflict African countries and learning and kind of amazed by it. So that's part of what we were talking about was forgiveness, because she couldn't figure out how to ask for forgiveness because she couldn't remember the people that she'd hurt and wounded or killed, And I went with her. I was out there, I don't know, 3 or 4 times probably. But the second time I went, she said, "Why don't you teach me how to use your camera?" And I said, "Yeah, okay." And I had a digital with me and I had my Leica. So I gave her the DSLR as a Canon. I kind of showed her, here's what you push and she was really insistent. And she's like, "Okay." She said, "I'm going to show you." And I had a translator there. But she walked me through that village, and she would stop and take pictures all along the way, like really intently. And I just let her shoot. And when we finished and we went back and we looked at the photos on the back of the camera, and I asked her what they were about. And this work is on my website, forgivenessandconflict.com. It's called In My Life, the story of an ex-girl soldier. And she had I wound up making an edit of 12 pictures. But she told me the story, the metaphorical story, she understood metaphor, of what she had done as an ex-girl soldier, what had happened, how she was abducted, things that she did. And she was so honest. A lot of the ex-child soldiers would just kind of go, I didn't do anything. Miriam was really honest about what had happened. She was a really powerful person. But there was this one moment where we were walking through the village and she encountered a friend of hers who had a little baby with her. And the little girl started crying. They set her on the ground and she kind of rolled over on her back. not, dangerously, but she rolled over on her back and she just was cranky and she started crying. And I watched Miriam just like completely, like her head snapped. And she went over and shot pictures, just a couple of the girl. And when we were talking about the picture, and bear in mind, I'd explained like metaphor. The metaphor is like this is something. It's not like this is like something, which is simile. Yeah. But metaphor is literally that's me or that's. And we got to that picture and she said, this little girl is me. She's lying on the road crying exactly the way I did when I begged the soldiers not to rape me. The level of her, and then there's a lot of other things that she talked about in that story. And this is what we did, and this is where I hid, and all using her village to do it. And then I did some collaborative things. I did a portrait of her where I had to hide her actual identity, and we shot together in the mosque where she does try to find forgiveness. And I really, really, really dislike photographers who talk about giving voice to people, because that's just bullshit. Everybody has a voice. Everybody has a voice. Not one of us gives a voice to somebody else. We're all born with them. We have them. We know how to use them. Sometimes we use them at the top of our voices, and sometimes we use them to tell secrets. But we have a voice. The only thing a photographer can do, or a writer or anybody else, may be to give the room for that voice to be amplified. Miriam had a voice. She didn't. I had nothing. I just needed to get out of the way of that voice and listen to her. I gave her a camera to let her use her visual voice. So, and I could see that for her, she was now, I think she was 21 by this point, and she had been abducted when she was 11. To see somebody whose narrative was taken away from them as a child by adults, by men, her narrative was completely taken and written by others. To watch her and the authority she had from telling her own narrative was amazing. And I think I try to work collaboratively whenever I can. Since then, I've learned so much from that. I'm so much more interested in, when it's a project that involves somebody else's life story, I'm so much more interested in what they want to say about themselves too. I work that way with the homeless now, and the big encampment down in Orange County that was one of the largest homeless encampments in America, and it was closed last year. But I worked with the people there, I had them write on my photos. It was a really wonderful collaborative process. I think it's really humbling and really wonderful to realize that you're not the most important voice in the room, and you're not the only one who can tell the story, or who can even tell the story the best.
I know a lot of photographers who would bristle at that statement. The second part of that is the forgiveness rituals that practiced throughout Africa, which is really sort of fascinating. I first heard of that after the events in South Africa, the end of apartheid, and that was like, it was the first time I'd ever heard the concept, and it's been an important part of some of the work that you've done. I know it's sort of a hard thing to sort of encapsulate, but why don't you share with us what that's about, and how did you approach it from a visual perspective in terms of telling that story?
So I first encountered the idea of forgiveness in Sierra Leone before I even met Miriam, the ex-girl soldier. But I first encountered this idea of it as a way to restore relationships. And there had been a tradition in Sierra Leone called Fambul Tok, which means family talk, which involved resolving conflict through conversation. And I met a young human rights activist who wanted to restore this tradition as a way to heal at the village level things that had happened in the war, because the special courts came in and indicted 12 people that they thought were the most responsible, for causing the war. And the relatives of those people had parties when they went in because they knew they were going to have great facilities and, access to the internet and stuff. It didn't touch anybody's lives in a country where villager neighbors had harmed each other. So that's what this restoration of Fambul Tok was about. And I got to document that photographically. And I also made a documentary film about it that was supported by Sundance and premiered at South by Southwest. And I think played at a couple hundred festivals around the world. But part of that led me to want to know more, because there's 52 countries in Africa, or is it 53, all different, even within one country, different tribes, different traditions. So you can't generalize, and I don't mean to sound like that. But there is a distinctly African tradition of the importance of community over the individual. You cannot be healthy as an individual if your community isn't healthy, which is very different to what we have in the West. So, and there were no jails in Africa until the colonial powers came. There was constantly an effort you would bring a wrongdoer in the presence of the community. They have to confess to what they've done. That's a really important part. You confess and take responsibility. You apologize and ask for forgiveness. And the cultural mandate response is to forgive. Mm-hmm. The work is in the reconciliation that follows, the reparations that happen. And I think this is still more rooted or more practiced or prevalent in more rural spaces where it can be done. Urban spaces can be so anonymous and nondescript. But I've talked to people who've lived in cities and who understand these comments. And the idea is there's a proverb for it in Sierra Leone. There's no bad bush to throw away a bad child. Which means we can't afford to get rid of anybody. I mean, they see humans as resources. And if you take somebody away from the community and put them in jail, you've taken away the resources that person might have for the community's good and put them in jail, and the community's having to pay for them to be in jail. So it just doesn't make sense in that context and in that way of maintaining, the health and vibrancy of a community. So I looked at it in a lot of places. South Africa I wasn't going to go there originally because people would always go, oh, you mean like the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa? And I'd be like, no, I'm talking about bonfires in villages in Sierra Leone where perpetrators and victims face each other, and in the presence of their communities. And the Truth and Reconciliation, but I realized because so many people reference that, I was like, okay, I need to put that in the project. So when you ask what I photograph, in Fambul Tok, I was photographing communities and bonfires. I mean, there were things happening. I could do it that way. South Africa, I was like, I have to anchor this project in South Africa or include it as a chapter. And my chapter is called Landscapes from Nelson Mandela's South Africa, because so many Westerners think that, they don't immediately kind of go, oh, right, that Fambul Tok tradition. They go, oh, right, that very European, people in suits traditions that happened in South Africa. The genius of that was that it got the truth out for the first time. But as any South African will tell you, it had nothing to do with reconciliation. So that chapter is still waiting to happen. So in approaching South Africa, I was like, wow, how do I tell this story? I had been on Robben Island, which is the former prison colony, the island off of Cape Town where Nelson Mandela and many other anti-apartheid activists had been jailed. And I'd heard some stories of prisoners who'd forgiven their guards, and the guards who'd been forgiven. I was like, maybe I could do portraits of that, just as a way of showing it and tell those stories. And then there were people, as I was talking, they're like, yeah, that's kind of touristy, that's a bit gimmicky. Yeah. And I was like, okay, I don't want to do that. And then I had the idea of documenting every one of the 52 places where a Truth and Reconciliation hearing was held and trying to find somebody who had testified. Okay, I mean, so this is the part of me that's verbal, right? Yeah. And I still do research and work. And I could nearly impossible to track these things down. I think once I might have found that list and then I lost it. But I did find the first hearing and the last hearing. And I realized to tell this story as I kept reading and learning more about South Africa, every single person in South Africa is tied to the land. Everybody, whether you're Afrikaner, Black, I mean, everybody has a history in the land. And Nelson Mandela, in his inaugural speech as president, said, each of us is personally tied to the land of South Africa. That's why I called it the chapter, Landscapes from Nelson Mandela's South Africa. So I knew it had to be landscapes. And I knew I had to work in a medium format. I had a Mamiya 7, and I went and found the landscapes that were part of the history. They're from the Boer Wars to the Great Trek, for the Afrikaners, to Soweto, the Sharpeville uprisings, the shootings, that happened there. They were. I was in a particular spot where the arms trade had been really active, where Black tribes had been in conflict with each other, but it was the center of arms trade in South Africa. I went to the cemetery where Steve Biko, the Black consciousness activist, was buried. I was a really young reporter when he died, and he was always in my mind, as part of that story. So I went and photographed the landscapes, and then I wrote these very short texts that told you more about that landscape. And in one place, there was an overlapping landscape that had been a really important. The Afrikaners, the concentration camps, they didn't start with Germans in World War II. They started with the Boer Wars. The British started them in South Africa. And both Afrikaners and Blacks were in concentration camps. And the Afrikaner version of the story completely fails to mention that Blacks were in concentration camps and actually suffered more than they did. But that's a key, sort of part of an Afrikaner history. And there was this one place where there had been an Afrikaner concentration camp, and I went and I shot it, and there were these two, so it's like looking for the things that tell the bigger story. Mm-hmm. And you know those signs that you find on the side of the road, like at the Grand Canyon, that say, here's the north entry, here's that. There were two of those signs, and they were completely destroyed. They were rusted out. There was nothing left. The Afrikaner biggest fear is their history, them being wiped out of South Africa. And it also turned out that this was the same town where Winnie Mandela had been banished in the apartheid era. So these two, there were these overlapping histories in this landscape. So that's the first time I've ever really worked in landscape, but I think it works. I've showed it to some, Ann Tucker, again, people who I trust have been like, did I get this landscape thing right? Because I've never, worked in that. And they were like, yeah. So it's to understand you could try to tell this complex history of a place that has not reconciled. I mean, I talk about the project, that chapter, as a way of imagining the landscape of reconciliation. For me, and I would never presume to think I could, speak to, for a South African. But so it was all over the place. In Rwanda, everybody kind of like loves to think Rwanda is some great big reconciliation story. Like, no, it's not. It's a pretty scary and dangerous place where the current president, who like the West has adored for years until recently when he kind of made constitutional changes that just about make him president for life. But for years, because he made economic stuff happen there, the West thought he was amazing. And yet he's an autocrat, and there's no freedom of the press, and there's all this suppressed language in Rwanda. So, and you can't really shoot without being licensed or having some kind of permit. So I shot there with my iPhone, and that chapter is postcards from Rwanda. Okay. So I had to work in metaphor to explain these deeply rooted, deeply hidden conversations that aren't happening. I mean, there's certainly been some genuine reconciliation and progress, but oh my goodness, the messaging in that country, which is all about messaging Tutsis, who were the discriminated against. They were the ones who were suffered in the genocide, Tutsis and moderate Hutus. But the entire visual landscape of Rwanda is being remade in the likeness of Tutsis. It's like, you can't, to be Miss Rwanda, to apply to participate in the pageant, you have to be 5'7" tall. The average Hutu is 5'4". There's almost never, it's almost a guarantee there will never be a Hutu Miss Rwanda. So how do I do that visually? And and that's where I worked on postcards from Rwanda with my iPhone.
Let's talk about the Aftermath Project. Tell us a little bit about the idea behind it and why it's become so important to you.
2 years into the Bosnia work, I took a workshop at the Santa Fe workshops. I'd never shown the Bosnia work. I mean, I was still, barely a photographer. And I took a class with Sam Abel for photographers working on long-term projects.
I'm going to be talking to him later today.
Oh, tell Sam I said hi. He kept asking this one question. It's like, what impact do you want your work to have? And I was like, I don't know. I mean, as a journalist, I could tell you. I mean, as a journalist, my work was used to pass laws in Congress. It was, the United Nations used one series to help write the draft on the, the Convention on the Rights of the Child. I know impact with that, but I was like, I have no idea. And because I didn't. It was just this project I felt I had to do. And so I kept thinking about it. And then I was like, yeah, I know what I'd like the impact of this work to be. It would be that younger photographers know that they don't have to be conflict photographers, that that's not the only path, that you could be an aftermath photographer. And I was like, God, that's such a good answer. And then, and about 24 hours later, I was like, okay, Sarah, let's think about this. Nobody knows who you are as a photographer. You're doing an aftermath project on a war that the West really didn't care about in the first place. And you think that somehow you're going to inspire other photographers to be post-conflict storytellers? It was like, get a grip. And I went like, oh, right, okay. And then almost immediately on the heels of that, and I have no idea why there was no filter in my head that day that said, what the heck are you thinking? That's going to be really hard. But the next thought was like, well, then I'll just start a grant program. We'll give a grant and it'll be a competition and we'll start funding, me, post-conflict storytelling. That's how to make the impact. And I was like, I don't know what I was thinking because I was still in the same place, covering a war that nobody cared about and only 2 years into it as a photographer. I mean, I believe so deeply that war is only half the story. Those are the 6 words that have really become the catchline for the Aftermath Project. I know that there are moments of great heroism and humanity during wartime, but in general, I think war is the story of our inhumanity and how we destroy. And I think Aftermath is the story of where we learn to live again, where we learn to reassert our humanity, and where our humanity is what gets us through. So I don't know, it just became, I just sort of step by step. It was probably 3 years before we gave the first grants. It involved, getting photographers to donate prints and do auctions for the first year of grants and finding an advisory board. It was kind of crazy because, again, like I said, nobody really knew who I was as a photographer, but I don't know. We had an amazing group of prints that, raised $35,000 in that first year, and we did 2 grants, and then other funders came on pretty quickly, Open Society, and I think it was just because those is a really simple idea. War is only half the story, and they understood it. And they also, at that time in particular, because it was all war all the time, they were the awards. I mean, I respect my colleagues who risk their lives, but there's also plenty of people who, parachute in and out of conflict or think that's the way to go make a name for themselves, which is bullshit. And it's, and there's a long and respected tradition of it in photography. It's one of our dominant narratives. So Aftermath is a counter narrative. I think that's what all my life is in many ways, is building counter narratives. And it hit the 10-year mark, and I'm right where we've also, you were a judge as we started granting again. We've done our 11th grant. We're looking for ways now to find long-term funding or a way to anchor the work. I'm ready to have somebody else run it. I will always be a voice for it and always be part of it. But I have other work to do. I've joined Seven. I'm a filmmaker. There's just other things I need to do. I don't personally feel I have any more post-conflict stories in me, which is fine. That's the way I work. I move through things, but as one of my board members says, it's obvious, but it's like, as long as there's conflict, there's got to be an Aftermath project.
Yeah. But what was interesting in sitting in, going through all that work, because there was so much work that we spent all day, was the chance to see people who were from the communities and the countries wanting to tell their own stories. And over the span of 10 years, you've probably seen a lot of that. How has that impressed you, rather than someone from the outside coming in and documenting and telling the story? What have been your takeaways from seeing all the various submissions over the last decade taught you in terms of what's possible in terms of people telling their own stories?
Well, to be fair, I would say that most of our grants have actually gone to people going to a place to tell a story. So it's only been in the past couple of years, right, that the photo world has been more committed and more aware and found more resources of photographers in other parts of the world. I remember once we ran a grant that Howard Buffett's foundation funded in the Western Sahel region of Africa, and I reserved one of those grants specifically for an African photographer. I said it was really important that we have someone from the continent. There were only 4 applications at that time and we gave it to an African photographer, but we couldn't find, it was more limited in outreach and what we could find. So that's just a caveat. Okay. So we've had a lot of, maybe somebody from the region, has told it, and sometimes it's been a pure outsider. I have nothing against outsiders going in and telling stories. I'm very interested in how a Vietnamese photographer would portray America. I want to see that. Yeah. So I'm not of that, what I feel is kind of the PC thing. I am very much a proponent of amplifying opportunities so that people from a region can also participate in global narratives and specifically their own narrative. We had a wonderful photographer, one of our finalists, maybe in year 3, Saiful Hook Omi, who was reporting on the Rohingya back then, like 10 years ago. And a story that an outsider wouldn't have paid any attention to at all. And he was a finalist. He didn't get the grant. But in naming finalists, that's a really important, as you know now, you've been a judge, it's a really important thing to us because in the first 10 years, we did an annual book that was of the grant winner and finalists' work. We'll probably be doing exhibitions instead of that going forward. But our 10th anniversary book, grant winners and finalists, we really want to elevate and expose those stories. So I'm excited. I was just looking at some portfolios of African photographers. Yesterday, my photo agency is open for new members, 7, and we're looking at all kinds of people and places. And I saw some amazing work from the African continent, which is it's indigenous. It's rooted there. Yeah. It's like, oh, because the West went and taught them things or whatever. So that's exciting to me. But I think that's the space we're in right now as an industry.
Okay.
In understanding, like I said, that we don't have the loudest voice in the room.
Let me ask a follow-up that's tied to an answer you gave before. And you were talking about the beauty pageants and sort of the criteria that's established that distinguishes Tutsis and Hutus. And so in terms of these photographers from other parts of the world entering contests, competitions, grants, and they're coming from a very different experience, access to certain materials or, all that stuff. And the criteria by which they're being judged is one that's largely been established by Western sensitivities. Mm-hmm. So what's necessary to ensure that people who have those stories to tell, who are making photographs that may not necessarily sort of fall in line with what's been sort of traditionally accepted, what needs to be done in order for those people to take advantage of the opportunities that so many people have always been afforded?
That's a good question. I would say internally at the Aftermath Project, I always, if I found a photographer from a place, I made sure, that application stayed in contention or was brought to the attention of judges, because I think that's really important. Mm-hmm. It's not the role of the Aftermath Project to help develop visual voices in other parts of the world. That's not our mission. Our mission is in awarding grants, and we have certainly awarded to a pretty wide, variety of people and a probably almost 50-50 men and women, storytellers. I think programs, mentorships, are important. Photo agencies, Noor, 7 are doing that. I think World Press Photo is trying to open up and hold master classes. I think there's an obligation on us as the world with power. I love the phrase majority world, which means like everybody who's not white, because they are the majority. So I think there's an obligation that the rest of us have. We've gone and sort of used those canvases for storytelling and into advanced careers, have an obligation to give back. I think if people, I think with the way people are more connected in social media today, you can reach out. If you are from a majority world country or don't have an infrastructure, there's ways to say, can you help me with this? Can you show me this? But I think, if you need to take a workshop, and there are workshops, held in a lot of places and for free, for people, but just because you're from a place, if you're not a good photographer, it doesn't mean you should win a grant. And I realize that could sound kind of brutal, and I don't mean it to. Yeah. But I do think it's incumbent on our industry to go, all right, then, we're going to meet you where you are with workshops, like is being done by some of the organizations I've been talking about, or mentoring. I mean, 7 we have several mentees in majority world countries that work with 7 photographers to become better. So I just don't think it automatically means you should get a grant just because you're from the place.
Right. Mm-hmm.
That's not the type of organization the Aftermath Project is. I think there should be organizations to do that, if that makes sense. Does that sound harsh?
No. I mean, it makes perfect sense. I mean, we were faced with, some of the same issues when we were making judgments.
Yeah.
During the contest.
Yeah.
So it's like you have to sort of balance it out, not just in terms of quote unquote the quality of the work, but the likelihood that this person is going to be able to see it through.
Yeah.
Which is a big criteria. I think a lot of people just think that it's based on aesthetics or a really interesting story. It's so much more involved, especially with the grants that you're offering, that is contributing to people producing this.
Yeah, and building a conversation. And it's not work that just goes and sits on a shelf, which some grants are kind of like, here's your money, you can go do whatever. I mean, the Aftermath Project has an outcome, right? We've done the book and now exhibitions. We're building a conversation. We're educating the public. If I had the funding, I've worked my butt off to raise every penny that we have given away over the years. But if I had the funding, I would absolutely want to institute that kind of a program. I mean, because education has always been part of our outreach. We do lesson plans for schools. So I would, if somebody wanted to fund that, we could absolutely build in some sustained workshop work in post-conflict countries, for photographers who are there. I would love to do that. It gives me an idea for a funder I can ask about that, actually.
One last question before I ask you my really last question. Your father once made an observation about you when you were in college.
I told you that.
About him seeing you as a leader, which I think at the time when he said that to you, you were surprised by.
I laughed.
But given the many things that you've accomplished in your life, especially as a photographer and as the founder of this Aftermath project, what do you think about yourself now through the filter of what your father saw so many years ago?
I should tell what my dad said.
Yes.
Do you want to know that story?
Yeah.
I think I was, I don't know, like 21 or 22. And my father, a really imaginative, but very scientific man who worked on the Gemini and Apollo projects. I forget why on earth I had said something. And he goes, "Sis," that's what he called me, sis. He goes, "Sis, you're a natural born leader." I just like laughed out loud because whatever I just told him, it was so like completely not about being a leader. And I was like, wow, Dad, that's really interesting. Because if you looked behind me, because like there's nobody following, that's not exactly a leader, right? And he said, "No, Sarah." He goes, "It's what you do." He said, "You see the place to go and you just go." And he said, and other people catch up. He said, "That's a natural born leader." And I remember, I'm still kind of like, this gets me a little choked up thinking about that, to think of the permission that my father gave me at a really, young age as a young woman, especially at a different time in gender relations and things in our culture and in profession. And that he pretty much said, it doesn't matter. You're an original thinker, or I don't know what he was. Here's a man who helped put man on the moon, who had to think through some crazy things. So what he was seeing in me to like go, yeah, you just go where you think you need to go. And people follow. And that he gave me that is like, it doesn't matter if people follow or not. So I think that's, in many ways, I internalized that. And I think that's why I've just moved across media. It's why I've always worked, maybe like, oh, what's your 5-year plan? I'm like, oh my God, if I had a 5-year plan, it would blow up in my face. I've always worked really intuitively. I've done what I felt I had to do because it needed to be done. And part of what my dad said is probably what gave me, maybe that's the voice in my head that was like, yeah, I'll start a grant program. Maybe that was my dad saying, go for it. Too, yeah. What an incredible permission to give to people to say vision and capacity and accomplishment don't have anything to do with how many people tell you that you're right.
It's beautiful. Well, my last question is I ask each guest to recommend another photographer for listeners to discover and explore, and it can be anyone. Someone you've long admired or someone you've recently discovered. So who would that one photographer be and why?
Urias. I think he's a Nigerian photographer, and it's not his name. I just was looking at his work yesterday. He's Moroccan, and his Instagram post or handle is YORIYAS.
Yeah.
Blew my mind. He's got a lot of followers. I'm probably like the last person in the world to discover him, but yeah. Whew.
Yeah, really cool stuff. I follow him too.
Yeah. See, you knew. What can I say?
Sarah, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks to Sarah for sharing her time and story with us. You can find out more about her and her work by visiting her website at saraterry.com. And for more information on the Aftermath Project, visit theaftermathproject.org. And this summer, I'll be in Washington, D.C. for the Focus on the Story Photographic Conference. This international photo festival will feature some of the world's best photojournalists and documentary photographers, as well as talks, photo walks, and workshops, of which I am teaching one. If you want to sign up for the workshop or you just want to find out more about the event, visit focusonthestory.org. And remember to check out my YouTube channel, where I discuss different aspects of photography by pulling images from listeners like you who contribute to the Candid Frame Flickr poll. You can check out the TCF Flickr poll and our YouTube channel by clicking on the link in the show notes and the website. My new book, Making Photographs, Developing a Personal Visual Workflow, is now available. In it, I translate how to see and use light and shadow, line and shape, color and gesture to make great photographs. It's more than just how to make a good picture every once in a while. It's about a way of developing your own personal and intimate way of seeing and documenting the world around you. You can order the book today, When you place your order from the Rocking Nook website, use the promo code Pirello40 to receive 40% off the list price. Check out the website and the show notes for the link. And if you want to keep up with all things Candid Frame, sign up for our mailing list, and you'll receive 3 free copies of my previously published ebooks. And if you like what you've been hearing on the show, please take the time to write a review in the iTunes Store, Spotify, or the Google Play Store, or wherever you find and listen to podcasts. And if you write a review on a blog post, let me know and send me a link, because I would really like to thank you on air. You can also support the show by making a monthly contribution through Patreon, or you can make a one-time contribution via PayPal. You'll find the links for both in the show notes and the website. Thanks to Francesco Scaglione, Colin Gavril Goya, and Peter McClellan for their recent contributions. Thank you so much. And if you want to easily access every episode of The Candid Frame, download the Candid Frame app. It's available for Apple iOS and Android, and it's free. Download it today. You'll find it where everything else is, in the show notes or the website at thecandidframe.com. And we also have an Alexa app. So if you have one of those smart devices, download the skill and listen to the show that way. The Candid Frame's audio engineer is Martin Taylor, who you can find at theothermartintaylor.com. The show's senior producer is Cynthia Parker, and our music is from Kevin MacLeod, whose royalty-free music can be found at incompetech.com. And you can follow me on Twitter and Instagram at simply @IbarianX. And this is Ibarian X, and this is The Candid Frame.